Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start now because I think it's already 5 past and we have quite a lot of participants already. So we will start with the video. We will probably have to turn it off in a few moments because I feel like it's going to make the quality of the webinar better or worse. So my name is Tamar. I work for Action Against Hunger UK, based in London, and I work as a monitoring and evaluation officer. And
hello, I'm Mari Agni. I also work in Action Against Hunger UK as a senior project officer, also in monitoring and evaluation. So we'll be co-presenting today.
Yeah, and I think perhaps we can turn off the camera just for now. So yeah. Thanks again for joining us. We will start, maybe just close the camera for a moment.
Yes. Just also to say that we have Alice with us in the room, and she will be monitoring the chat at most times. So if any of you have issues, feel free to write in the group chat, and we'll be looking at them in due time. Thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, so before we kind of jump into today's topic, we just wanted to give Alice a moment to explain a little bit about the Depth Learning series and webinars. So Alice, here you go.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us. This, as you probably know, is the first webinar in our learning series. The series is being run by the Learning Project, which is responsible for supporting projects in the Disasters and Emergencies Preparedness Programme, or DEP, and increasingly also in the sector at large to capture learning based on implementing programmes and to share it at the local, national and international levels. And one of the ways that we're doing that is through this learning series. The learning series is comprised of 9 webinars. We are running them until the 15th of November. Many will be like this one, so they're practical, they're skills-based sessions to build capacity to capture and share our learning around what does work and what doesn't work. Other webinars will be more thematic. They'll focus on the learning that we've gained around things like localization and capacity development in humanitarian preparedness. But you can find all of the information you need about all of the webinars on our learning platform. We'll also be uploading recordings of every session there so that you can listen back and share with colleagues. I'll send out the relevant links to all of those and to the learning platform in general, which is a very useful resource too, after this webinar. So thanks everyone, enjoy the session, and if you have any problems or anything to say, just write them in the chat and I'll be on hand to help you out.
Thank you very much, Alice, for the kickoff. Can we just check before we start that everyone can hear us loud and clear? Perhaps you can just answer in your chat. Can you hear us? Is it working? Great. Thank you, David. Thanks, Hosan. Okay, perfect. So I'll just start by outlining the sessions, how it's going to work today. So we did our introductions. We're then going to spend about 30 minutes or a bit more on the kind of the case study guidelines, looking at the definition, at the types available, some guidance around how to write your own case study, kind of from the thinking, from the, seeding the plant of the idea to the actual implementation and writing of your case study. And then we're going to have about 20 to 25 minutes of questions and discussions. So if we could ask you to, whilst the presentation is going, to write your questions in the chat. We will monitor them. We will aim to answer all the questions at the end of the session, so we can kind of get the presentation out of the way and get to the discussion point. However, if anything is very unclear or very urgent, obviously let us know and we will stop in the middle. Yeah, so I think we're ready to go, and we'll start with the first slide.
Yes. Okay. Let's move into the presentation. Okay, just a second. Oops. Oh. Slide technical. Yes. Okay. I'll just use mine. Right. So we thought of starting with the case study definitions and purpose. Obviously. Borrowing some information and sources from academia. Case study refers to the collection and presentation of detailed information, usually talking about a particular person or a small group of people, frequently including data that comes from the subjects themselves. That's a more technical definition, but when we apply to the humanitarian or development sector, we would more simply say that is a detailed descriptive narrative. So it's definitely descriptive of either individuals, communities, organizations, events, and that also refers to a specific program or time period. This is more to set our brains around what a case study refers to. And an even simpler way to put it is if we break down the name. So a case is about the story and the event or the real life situation that we want to examine, and the study refers to the analysis of the situation. And this is quite important because even though it's a descriptive product, there's also an analytical element in it. The same way we want to make clear what a case study is, we also want to clarify what a case study is not. So we thought of taking a few examples that are often confused with case studies, and that also comes down to the purpose that I'm going to talk about in a few moments. So a case study is different from an evaluation. It's also different from a press release or a purely communications product. It's not a report, although it can be attached to a report or can be used as a supporting document for a report. There are two different products and they serve different purposes. And also to put it into a specific context that we're gonna talk in later today. There's a different product to a case study, which could be an impact story. So the impact story, I'm going to explain a bit later what we're talking about, but they have lots of similarities, but also differences. So maybe have a thought as we speak. If at any moment in your the course of your work you had any kind of issues in choosing what to go for, or if any products were used instead of a case study or anything else. Okay, let's move on to the purpose. So the reason of conducting and producing a case study is basically to analyze a situation which can reveal information that otherwise would be ignored or not even known. And this is quite important because evaluations, reports, or different types of research products can give information about a particular program or a particular event within a program or a group of people, but they can't normally go into such detail and they don't analyze the situation in an investigative way. So why doing a case study? We want to do a case study to investigate a detail of a particular story, event, or phenomenon. We want to share knowledge with others. That's why we often do a case study to highlight a particular aspect. We want to engage others, and the reason why we use case studies also in communications or fundraising as well, or for donor purposes. We want to learn about a program and or we want to call for change or action by explaining how a particular situation has evolved. Other reasons of doing case studies, looking a bit deeper into this product, is that we want to focus on the why and the how a particular situation has evolved. And as you can see in the presentation, we've highlighted the so what. So often people produce reports or other types of communication products, but they forget to these products maybe have a worthwhile story to tell, but people forget to mention why this story is so worthwhile. So a case study often is accompanied by the so what. What does it mean? Why do we highlight this? What does this event or particular good practice calls for? Is it something that should be avoided, should be replicated? Also, a case study has a specific and targeted focus. So as you will see from the next part where we talk about the methodology, you could be already thinking about which question you want to answer through your case study. We often say that case studies serve as sense-making tools, which means that you can use it to explain a situation or make sense of something that has not been drawn attention so far. It's good to share knowledge within the sector, and you can also use it as a tool, as it happens often in academia as well, to share knowledge with other staff and colleagues, and used as a capacity building tool. So after presenting the purpose of case studies, it's maybe a moment for you to reflect if there's any other reason why you're using case studies in your everyday life, and why do we write them, why do we use them. Feel free to hold that for the end of the session, or you can write in the chat. And then I think we're ready to move into the types of case studies, so I'm gonna hand it over to Tamar.
Yeah, all right, thank you, Mariagni. So as we talk about the types of case studies, there are a couple of things that I want to kind of say in advance. So obviously a lot of the way that we think of a case study analysis and methodology or approach is very much coming from academia and qualitative research. We as practitioners, we don't have to confine to the same kind of rigid descriptions or I don't know, the way that we have to do. We don't have to say which case study we are going to do, but I think it's kind of helpful to think of the different types, because it kind of helps also grounding us a little bit in the theory and the rationale behind this approach. And as we go through the examples, I would like you to think about the case studies that you normally do, and whether you can classify them as one or another. So most of the case studies, or the kind of the overwhelming majority, at least in our sector, I would say, are explanatory. So the word comes from the word to explain. So we would like to explain some either relationships or a phenomena or something interesting about our program. And very much like an evaluation, we can look at two types of explanatory case studies. One would look at the program implementation, that is the process and how things went, really looking at the operations. And the other would look at the effects. Now, we need to be a little bit careful when we think of case studies that are related, explanatory case studies that relate to the program effects. We look at the causality, so we're looking at whether our program has led to something. However, we're not trying to statistically prove it, and this is kind of the big difference between a quantitative research and a qualitative research, and especially case study research. So again, don't quote me if you're from the academia. I'm sorry if I'm making any mistakes, but it's really to kind of simplify and think for ourselves what is the case studies that we normally write. So if we look at the implementation, for example, we can look at our needs assessment. Have we done our needs assessment properly, and what did it lead us in terms of the implementation and designing our activities? So if we say that in our needs assessment, the group that we talked to was gender imbalance, so we didn't have enough women, how does it affect the activities that we do? Have we targeted the needs of women in this particular group if we hadn't done the needs assessment properly? So this is something that a case study could explore. But let's look at the kind of the other types of case studies. So in the next slide, you will see we have three categories. So illustrative, one that illustrates, describe the situation. The exploratory, which I think is very different from the explanatory, and we'll talk about it in a moment. And one that is talking about a critical instance. So one point in time, something very unique, or I don't know, it could be like an emergency situation, and something that is really worthwhile to look into. So for example, in the illustrative, so looking at the first type, the illustrative case study, this could really be about either an individual or a group of people. So for example, at the end of the program, you're writing your report, it was a preparedness program, and we want to see how did a training that was intended to help people prepared better for a disaster, how did the training affect them? So we're going and we're talking with a group or with an individual. So it's really to kind of add richness into your report or into whatever deliverable you have at the end of your program. The exploratory case study, on the other hand, we can look at it more as something we do at the beginning, and it doesn't have to be, but I think it's just an easier way to think about it. We are trying to explore what could be a useful activity to conduct. So if we're going back to needs assessment, in our needs assessment, we're talking with different people in the community, and we hear from them. It comes from the people. What is it? What are the problems? What are the issues? What are the challenges? Or actually, what are the positive factors? And based on that, we design our project. So then whether we're going to test an hypothesis at the end of it or not, that's something else. However, the purpose of the exploratory case study is to really think of something new. So we come to it very clean, we don't have any assumptions, and we're just trying to learn from the situation and let the situation teach us rather than do it the other way around. And finally, the critical instance, I think I talked already a little bit about it, would be on a very particular moment that you would like to highlight. So again, if we take it to the example of preparedness, you know, after a disaster stroke, would it be useful to look at how did we manage the situation and how did it change maybe in comparison to a year before we started the program. Finally, we have two more categories that we'd like to discuss, which is the comparative and the cumulative. I think the comparative case study really speaks for itself, so I don't need to go into too much details, but this could look at, you know, maybe the same program implemented in two regions that are very different in character. What does it teach us about the context? So for me, I look at it as a way to really understand context and how can context impact the project. So we could compare between two very similar projects or two very different projects. It really depends on what we're trying to achieve. And finally, the cumulative, which accumulates information from from many different case studies or reports, is very much what we also call a meta-analysis. So we say, you know, we've delivered the program, we wrote 4 case studies on the same region. Now, what is it, if we look at these 4 case studies, what is it that we can say about the overall program? What themes come out? What kind of conclusions we can bring based on this 4 or more case studies? So yes, in fact, to finish with this section, if you can think of the case studies that you normally work on, and if you'd like to share with us, or if you think there are other types that we have missed, then please do share with us either in the chat or in? Yeah. Yes, I think we can have someone is saying it increased awareness.
I do believe this refers to the purpose of the case study. I think this came before.
Okay.
So it's one of the reasons to conduct the case studies. Also, you can raise your hand in case you want to jump in the conversation and kind of fill something in. So we have someone saying brings out the real scenario. Yes, very well.
Absolutely, and especially if you look at the illustrative one, it really brings the kind of the richness of the situation as it is.
Thank you for your comments. So moving on, writing your case study step by step. This obviously came from a compilation of information, and we came down to what is the most kind of structured way to follow when you want to write a case study, but obviously you can adapt. This is the kind of logical flow that we would suggest for anyone writing a case study. So the key steps, we would first and foremost start with identifying who, what, where, and why. I'm going to go into more details next. And then the methodological part would follow, and that would include most likely a desk-based review, the design of the data collection tools and the data collection itself, and then the data analysis, which could also evoke decisions such as whether you have enough information, enough data, and whether you need to verify some of it. Then you would compile your case study, and then you would apply your dissemination strategy, which and the reason we put this green arrow there is because the dissemination strategy is something that should be decided at the beginning and will be defined by the who, what, and why. I'm going to go into detail for all of these. So first, we would suggest that anyone doing a case study would identify the focus of that case study. It should be clear, what do we want to investigate? Is it an individual? Is it a group? Is it an entity, an organization? Is it a particular situation or event? And you can maybe even start linking the focus of the case study to some extent to the type of case study that Tamara explained before. A very simple example that we put on that slide is we want to talk about adolescent girls and boys in northern Uganda. So this is the protagonist of the case study. Next, we would want to identify what is it a case of. So we could be talking about a case of successful implementation in a particular program, meaning maybe a good practice or maybe a project that yields some successful results. We could be talking about the issues and the barriers to successful implementation, and that could be linking with the learning we want to share, and like maybe barriers or bottlenecks that we want to avoid for next time. We could be talking about a typical day in a community and the way the project works, or we could be comparing different projects, such as a smaller one or a larger one, or project in different locations. And then we would look at the site or the place that this case study is happening. So this is the way we have explained it here is a little bit looser than if we were talking only about a location. So we could be talking about a specific site. So it could be a refugee camp. It could be a function that is also location specific or location independent, like a trainer of trainers model that is remotely based. We could be talking about a specific project or a policy or an office or department, or we could be focusing on a country or region for this case study. And then, quite important to identify the purpose and the audience of the case study. These two elements also are crucial to define what kind of dissemination strategy we want to build and who do we want to share with. What is the message that we want to build, and who are we targeting? So we could be targeting partners and peers. So maybe a case study that focuses on learning for project staff. We could be targeting, so maybe a locally focused case study could be targeting the upper management or the headquarters to kind of share the real case scenario, as someone very nicely said before. We could be targeting policymakers or donors. And the reasons would be, as I said, to share knowledge about what works and what doesn't. To answer a specific question, maybe exploring causality, as we mentioned before, about how our intervention affects the communities that we are serving, or we want to gather information from communities to further understand the reasons why some of our practices work or do not work. So based on all these elements, we would ask, what is the dissemination strategy? How do we want to share this product? And if we want even to develop additional products to accompany a case study report. So maybe think for yourself. And then starting forming the case study, the most important thing is to develop the research question. So what is the main question in relation to the protagonist? So as I said before, if we're looking at adolescent boys and girls in northern Uganda, what is it that we want to explore about it? Do we want to understand the way they perceive hygiene practices, for example? Is it a project related to sexual and reproductive health and the messages that we have passed on to them and how they have reacted to those messages? So what is the main question that we want to answer to? And related to that, before you actually form your questions, or as you're forming your question, you may want to use existing information, secondary sources to refine those questions. So existing knowledge or previously produced case studies or literature will be useful for you to refine your research questions.
Okay, thanks, Mariagni. So now that we have talked a little bit about the kind of the first part of the steps, we can jump into the methodology, and we'll try to make it not very boring, because methodology tend to be a little bit dry. So in a case study, when you write your case study, your methodology would normally start with the desk-based review. We'll talk about each of the steps in more detail. But we start with a desk-based review. Then we think of our sample. Who are we going to talk to, and where? All these questions that Mariagni asked before, the who, the what, the where, we have it already, so we should be able to know. Then we're thinking of our data collection. How are we going to collect data? What do we need to remember when we collect data? And then we're thinking of the analysis. So what is the most appropriate way to analyze? So starting with the desk review. So the desk review is a bit of a funny one, because I could place it at the beginning, but I could also place it at the end, at the moment that you write your case study. For me, the desk review helps us to define further our question, as Mariagni just said. So, for example, I could choose to do a case study based on reading that there is a gap in analysis, a gap in evidence. So, for example, if we take the example of sexual and reproductive health and how do we target adolescents with messages about sexual and reproductive health, I recently was involved in a project that was looking at the best ways to disseminate information. And I was doing my reading, I realized that we don't have much evidence about the most effective ways in a specific area that we were working in. So that was kind of a decision to make a case study that maybe can fill a gap in evidence. At the same time, your desk review can help you when you write your case study. So you've done your research, you collected your data, you put your findings on paper, but maybe you want to back it up. Maybe you want to say, well, actually, this is very much in line with specific theories, or maybe it contradicts the theory, which is also equally interesting and exciting to communicate. So in terms of the materials that you can review, you can obviously look at other case studies from our peers. You could look at academic research. You could look at different project reports and documents. Just Google, you know, there is a lot of stuff online. So after that, we're moving into the sampling. I think the sampling is very easy in a sense that it's not as a, you know, like in a statistical research, when you're trying to prove that something is statistically significant, your sampling needs to be very rigorous. The sampling needs to be rigorous as well here, but it's more led by our thinking and our reasoning. So we would use a purposive sample, so purposeful sampling, meaning that we target specific people. We're not trying to make it a random sample. Random sample is most likely not appropriate or not needed for a case study research. So let's look at a few examples. So we thought about the types of case studies before. So if I want to say something about how the program did in general, so I want to summarize the kind of the strengths of the project, it won't really be appropriate for me to go into a very unusual site and talk to people there, right? I'm looking for something that maybe is the typical or the average site. So I won't go to the furthest communities, but I won't also go to those closest to the location of activities. I would try to find something in the middle. At the same time, if we're trying to show an exceptional example or something that is very unusual, I would go to those communities that are furthest from the location of activities, or for example, from the health clinic where activities took place. So there is always kind of some correlation between what you're trying to show and the location that you would choose. In any sample, we would always, if we're trying to show kind of how the project did on average, we would go and look into the different people and the different locations that people have been working in. So I would look at a range of locations and a range and a mix of beneficiaries. So the younger ones, the older ones, I would make sure that it's gender balanced, and that would kind of give me an overall picture of how the project did. Okay, so in terms of the data collection, after we have decided what is our sample, we need to identify our key informants and to see what is the best way to collect data. So as you were probably very, very much aware, most of the case studies would use, as well as most evaluation and research, would use a focus group discussion, interviews, either structured or semi-structured. It could also be informal conversations. So, you know, just walking with a community leader as you are approaching the room and asking some questions and trying to kind of get your information from different types of sources. But you need to understand what is important for you is to think of who is the person that is important to talk to. It won't be appropriate, for example, to only talk with community leaders, right? Because we know they are going to give us their own perspective, and they don't necessarily represent what the community always feels. So this is the kind of things that you need to be careful of. And in terms of the ways that you could collect your data, we obviously, what I'm saying is mostly related to primary data collection, but we can also do secondary data collection, which means we're building on someone else's data or even existing reports. And yes, indeed, we're thinking of how we're going to, what do we need to remember when we collect the data? So there are a few ethical considerations, and there are a few things that we need to remind ourselves, such as logistics, what time of the year we're going to collect data. A lot of the times, and I'm sure you would you know it from your own experience. We get to a point of doing an evaluation, and then we realize actually there's an election. But if we had thought about it in the design, if we knew that election period is coming, we would probably decide not to do data collection in that time. So a lot of the things that can be kind of planned for when you start your project. And then you just obviously making sure that there are no delays and everything goes more smoothly. But we wanted to touch a little bit about the things that you need to remember when you conduct either focus group or you supervise enumerators that conduct a focus group, or actually even interviews. It doesn't really matter, any type of primary data collection. So we talked a little bit about ethical considerations. We want to make sure that we represent the community as a whole and not just choosing those that are easier maybe to approach. We also want to make sure, if we're talking about focus group discussion, there will always be, as I'm sure you know, there will always be someone that is very confident and talks a lot, and there will always be a few people that are kind of more quiet and shy. So we as facilitators, we have the responsibility to make sure that we try to represent everyone's voice. We also need to remember to be neutral, and like not to influence the discussion. So we influence the discussion in as much as we want to get people's reaction and, you know, maybe focus. However, we're really keeping it open for them to raise their concerns or their opinions. We would normally go with an interview guide or focus group the guide, but we just also need to remember that we need to be sensitive to the natural rhythm of the conversation. So the guide needs to be there because we want to make sure that we can compare and we can verify information. So if we do 10 focus group discussion, we want to make sure that we do have some factors that we can accumulate from all of them. So if we ask different question in any focus group discussion, obviously it would be very, very hard for us to say, you know, to conclude the case study. But at the same time, we need to be sensitive to the kind of natural rhythm. We try to avoid asking leading questions. We try to kind of manage the conversation. We talked a bit before about people that are very dominant. We want to make sure that they don't control the conversation. And of course, we want to take into account the gender, for example, gender balance, or whether it would be more appropriate. Oh, someone has. So we want to make sure that we speak with women and men separately if it's appropriate. Maybe we can just mute all. No. All right, I think I'm muted. Sorry to have muted you. So yeah, I mean, as the example that Mariagni gave before, when we talk with adolescents about sexual and reproductive health, it won't really be appropriate to speak with girls and boys at the same time, right? So we need to make sure we separate the groups, and we need to make sure that we have a private place. I know that this is very, very challenging. And a lot of the times you go to a community and everybody welcomes you and people want to be part, and you're saying it's quite hard to say, no, actually we need to speak in private. And I mean, I always, I even had situation when I stood at the door and I was just saying to people, I'm sorry, but you have to give us privacy, because people kept coming into the room where we're sitting. But we shouldn't be shy to say that it's private conversation, because what we need to ensure is that the people, the participants, are feeling comfortable and confident that you, as the leader of the focus group discussion, would kind of assure their privacy and confidentiality. We have one comment here, and I think it's very, very, very appropriate to mention. Absolutely, we need to consider whether there are people with disabilities. So when we select the location for the focus group discussion, or we select the time, we need to be mindful of that. In fact, obviously, we want to make sure that we include everyone in our sample as appropriate to your case study and to your research. Okay, so I think, yeah, we're running out of time. So we're going to talk quickly about the data analysis. In a case study, as we said before, since we're not looking at statistically significant sample, what we want to make sure is that whatever we put forward in our final report or our final writing has been triangulated. That means that we have asked different people from the community. So we don't make a statement like, in community X, all the women feel that the program has helped them to overcome, I don't know, issues at home. We can't say it unless we really feel like it is representing the different people that we have spoken to. So whatever we put forward needs to be reliable, meaning that if we talked with 10 women and they said 10 different things, we're not sure about, we can't make any conclusion on that. So maybe we need to go and ask more questions. We also want to make sure that our findings are valid. Sorry. And finally, we want to make sure that we have verified that what we have said is actually agreed upon between different people in the group that we have talked to. Then when we think of how we analyze and how we put everything in paper, what we normally suggest in a qualitative, in a case study, is to uncover. So we look at the findings we have, and we're trying to see, is there any theme, any pattern that we can talk about? So your themes could be either predefined, meaning that you went to this focus group discussion and you knew what you're looking at. So you want to hear a participant talking about specific aspects of your project. So your predefined themes would become your headers at your case study. But at the same time, as we said, we need to be sensitive to what comes out of people. And maybe there's other things that we want to include. So there are themes that we didn't think about, things that we didn't imagine would come up, but they did. So we should respect that and make sure that it's included in our analysis if it's appropriate. I think we can finish with this slide, the kind of methodological section. There is a lot of more information online and in the guidelines that we created, and we're happy to kind of give more information if you wish. So going into your writing of the case study, this is a little bit I wouldn't say controversial, but people feel differently about the sections. So I spoke with people that said, I don't think you should put this slide because a case study could look differently. It really depends on the content, and it doesn't have to follow a specific structure. We very much agree with that, but we just thought we'll give you the suggested sections that we feel like could be appropriate. So as in with anything you write, having an introduction is always useful because it kind of frames the discussion so the reader know what they expect. Putting a background section, I think it really makes it a stronger case study because you show that you have situated your case study within an ongoing discussion or maybe a new discussion. We also suggest to put the rationale. It's always useful for people to know, why are you writing this? Because a lot of the times you read things and if you haven't been involved, you're not really sure why is this case study even been written. So I think the rationale is very useful. Then we have the finding and the discussion, and this is where it can really be different from one thing to another. But your findings are basically everything you found in your data collection. And then it's really nice, I think, to put a section about discussion. So what does it mean? How does it relate to your research question? What does it teach you? Finally, you can also include a lessons learned section, and I think in our sector it's very popular to always put lessons and recommendations. In your lessons, you can always obviously remember to put bad or negative lessons, so it doesn't have to be all good. And the recommendation, and finally conclusion. Conclusion might be not always necessary because sometimes you can conclude through the lessons and recommendation, but it really depends on the content and your question. The conclusion does help you to look at kind of, all right, that was the question, that's what we did, and this is how we finish it, and maybe what are the next steps.
Cool. So towards the end, we thought of devoting a section and talking about internal processes and protocols, because usually a case study is part of a wider meal system and serves specific purposes, but also goes through the processes of organizations and consortia. So it's important to think in advance, to address in advance the fact that someone commissions the case study, someone has specific expectations, and there could be clear terms of references, validation processes, and deadlines beforehand. Otherwise, things get lost in the process. So agreeing some deadlines and processes of validation in advance can help you structure the timeline and the communication lines within your organization. It's important to think who is responsible to develop case studies when this is part of monitoring, evaluation, learning objective. And you could also think how these people could be supported. Sorry. Okay, it's okay. We just had a small technical hiccup. We can move on. So yeah, I was saying it's important to think how these people that are, it's in their job description or within their role to develop case study. How can they be supported? It's also something that we need to think about is whether there's one person, a member of staff, responsible from an organization, or whether the case study is jointly taken on by multiple actors, which could create coordination issues. And very much in line with our previous slides, dissemination strategy. Questions to think about are around additional communication products. Is the case study the sole medium in which you will pass on the messages? Would you need to use social media to kind of promote case study? Will be shared via email or other internal SharePoint networks? And so these are things that we advise that people think in advance. And again, the case study as part of a wider meal system can be linked to other elements of monitoring and evaluation, such as surveys or evaluation themselves. So a simple example is that an exploratory case study would be useful to do before a survey, because you may want to uncover some issues to explore, and therefore that will help you to design your survey. An explanatory case study could be used after a survey to explain why a particular situation has been involved in a specific way, such as hygiene practices that have not been taken on by specific communities, and what are the issues to be addressed in terms of specific contextual analysis or cultural norms that need to be further addressed. Case studies are often used for learning and accountability as well, or for communications and fundraising purposes. So this is, again, a question of how will you share and use your case study. This also brings us to the case study versus an impact story question. Are they a different thing, and how they differ from each other? So we took the perspective from a Humanitarian Leadership Academy colleague who was in touch with Tamar prior to this webinar. So we borrowed a couple of slides from them just to show what their point of view, what the Humanitarian Leadership Academy stake is at when exploring case study versus impact story, and how do they make the distinction, and how do they treat the process. So what is the difference between a case study and an impact story, and why are we clarifying the difference? A case study is a commissioned piece of research that is reporting back on a project or program. It involves reviewing a long-term project, including defined methodology. Often these case studies are used for evaluative donor-driven reports, conferences, or other reports. An impact story is a shorter description of a project and might only focus on a person or an outcome. They could also come from a longer case study or an interview. It's usually used for communications or other social media and websites purposes. We've also borrowed this slide to kind of show the process that the Humanitarian Leadership Academy follows to address when a new concept emerges and how it might end up serving the purpose of an impact story shared on a website, or a case study which is shared externally and or internally, or both. So we kind of see that in the case of an impact story, we focus on a specific person, a specific narrative, and we make the story really, really strong and impactful. We want to develop a story. In the case of case study, for them, rigorous research is required in order to understand the concept, in which case a case study is developed, and in which case the MEAL team is involved, whereas in the case of an impact story, the marketing and comms team are involved. So this is just a graph that we thought it could be food for thought for other people in organizations that maybe want to make clear distinctions for different products and how they can develop those products. I'm just gonna continue and finish off the presentation, and then we will take all the questions and comments. And so don't worry, we've taken notes of all of them, but we're also running short of time. So this was the presentation for developing case study. Just to mention that the guidelines are also available on the Depth Learning platform, and I believe Alice or Rita have already shared these, but we are happy to do the same after the end of this webinar. So maybe we can start going back to some comments and questions. I've already taken note of a few, so just to mention, yes. So the first, or even before that, we got a comment about references of secondary research. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, okay, sorry.
So there was a question, should we quantify information with footnotes or references of secondary information? So I believe that came at the moment where we were talking about the background information and developing the rationale. And personally, I'm quite supportive of referencing, because then other people can go back to the same information and the knowledge is better shared, in my opinion. So I would support the idea of when you develop the background of your case study, the background text, to reference information. On the other hand, if it's something that is kind of common knowledge or comes from multiple sources, maybe it's also kind of it's an overkill to mention something that's really simple. So it's also a judgment call. But in general, I'm quite supportive of referencing. And then the next one was about
ethics of research might raise wrong expectations. So that came from Angela Wagner. I'm not sure what you meant by it. So you're very welcome to. Angela, should we unmute you for a moment if you want to just tell us what you meant? Oops, you did it. Okay. Angela, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I wanted to say that it sometimes, you always, in terms of ethics of research, you always need to take into account that for people that you interview for such a case study, it may raise the expectation that their issues may be resolved in a short term, and it needs to be clear what kind of follow-up actions are going to be taken. after such an exercise.
Yeah,
From the
absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that comment. I think it's a very, 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 it's very important comment to make, that when you start your focus group discussion. And I think we see it a lot when we go to communities. I mean, we get, sometimes we are welcomed very well, and we start talking about what we need to talk, and it can raise the expectations of the community of what is it you're going to give later. So you always have to be very clear, and try not to give any false promises, obviously not to give any false promises, but really try to limit and explain and thank, obviously be very grateful for people's time, but maybe explain that it doesn't necessarily mean that you are able to change, or that the situation will change tomorrow, or that your organization is going to support in another program. And I think it's absolutely very, very important.
I also saw another a good comment, and I think it was linked with the tips and the good practices when doing primary data collection, to always try and ensure the neutrality of translators for the focus group discussions and the interviews. So yes, previous training of translators as much as for enumerators when doing data collection, would tremendously help to avoid issues when visiting communities and asking for information.
Yeah, so we, if people are happy to stay 5 more minutes, we can try to address the other questions. I can see that some people have already said thank you and left. So if you need to leave, that's absolutely fine. And thanks for your time.
Thank you for being here anyway. Absolutely. In the first place.
And let's just go back to a couple of questions. Did you talk about the translators?
Yes.
We talked about it. Okay.
And I think a comment from Diane, if I
Rodriguez,
yes, is that the case studies are commonly used as a success story. Yes, so obviously a case study could showcase a success and could showcase impact. I also saw a comment previously about using case studies to illustrate significant change. Mm-hmm. So obviously you're exploring possibly what kind of effects or impact a project or a particular intervention has brought in the lives of the people that are being served by this program. I believe that when we talked towards the end about the impact story, we want to make this stronger. We want to develop that from the point of view of the actual interviewee, of the actual protagonist. So we tend to use impact stories for people in the community, a mother that whose life was changed by a particular nutrition intervention, or a family that was helped by a cash intervention, and how their lives changed and how their livelihood was changed. But if we decide to go for a case study, we might take a more comprehensive view and look at the family as much as we look at the community. So I would say that the impact story is about the story of the protagonist, but the case study would take a view of analyzing more aspects of the intervention. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I also just want to quickly refer to whether an impact story is a success story or not. I think it really depends on your purpose. So if, so for example, our colleagues in the fundraising team might write an impact story that is not a success story, that is on the contrary quite a hard story to tell, that is designed to kind of raise awareness, or if we're going on a fundraising campaign, it might be used to kind of to raise people's attention. So that would be not necessarily at all a success story. If you're looking at an impact story from your project, that you're again, more likely, if you're using it for communication, you're more likely to use a good story and a success and how it changed people's lives for the good. But you can equally do it on the negative side. It really depends on what you're trying to get at. And I think we should be mindful that this is the impact story came from the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. And I would ask Paul that shared with us the slides, if we can give his email address as well, if anyone wants to ask any questions about the concept of an impact story.
There was an interesting question about, is a case study a better tool for qualitative research only, or can they also play a vital role in producing a good quantitative report?
That's an interesting one. Actually, I'm not really sure. So case studies would be brilliant in supporting quantitative information, because they try to explain and they try to look at the contextual, cultural norms. I'm not sure if a case study can have the same rigorous supporting mechanism. So as Tamara already mentioned in the methodology part, you can't really generalize by using a case study that a particular intervention works or doesn't work, just because you're investigating a single case. But I believe it's a brilliant method to actually support or make real quantitative information and reports. If I'm understanding the question well, obviously you can jump in and Shituma, and you can explain if you meant something different.
Yeah, and just in terms of the quantitative, so for example, if you do a survey and obviously the survey's been distributed to 100 people, then that's definitely, there's a quantitative aspect to it. You try to, aggregate information, and you can use the mixed method approach. You use your survey, you say, 50% of the population have said that, and then you go and you speak and you complement it with some qualitative information. So it's true that it's more likely to be used in qualitative approach, but it can also be used for a mixed method approach.
Yeah. Someone asked us if there's any comfortable number of or size of pages in terms of a case study. It's definitely a judgment call. So I've personally seen case studies of 10 pages, but they focus on telling a story of a particular partnership. And you can also see case studies of 3-4 pages, so more concise messages. So I would go back to the purpose and the audience. Who is this case study targeted for, and how likely are they to want more analysis or less analysis? Comms products tend to be shorter, but if you want to treat that as a quite elaborate research piece, or you need space to explain different aspects, then I would say you can extend the size to more than 4 or 5 pages.
Yeah, I think we have to finish, because I see that a lot of people need to leave, and it's been for us, a brilliant session, and we really, really appreciate your not just being here, but your participation on the chat. There are a lot of interesting comments and questions, and someone even asked for some examples, and we're very, very happy to follow up. So we'll send an email. Before you go, let me just quickly copy the chat so we don't lose your questions. All right, we already have it. But yeah, absolutely brilliant of you to participate and to be here. And we hope it's been useful.
Yeah, don't hesitate to get in touch if you have specific questions. I can say we have some kind of experience with case studies, so if we can help in any way, let us know, or let the Depth Learning Project know. Thank you very much again for being here today. We wish you a very nice day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.